Hello, my name is Bradley Thayer, and this is week 1 tutorial for the PHP MySQL course at South Mountain College. I am looking at Canvas right now at week 1 reading. Now, if I so choose to use this video over, which I may, I just want to note that this section may be different in future courses, but point being is that this week 1 reading is consistent across all semesters. You can see here that I'm calling out a competency which is defined by the Maricopa Community College. So all 10 colleges at Maricopa Community Colleges, Glendale, South Mountain, Estrella, etc., all follow these same competencies. In the textbook here, I am calling out chapters 1 and 2 for you to read and what I think you should feel comfortable with at the end of that reading. And if not by the end of the reading, then by the end of the lesson once you've done the labs. Okay. I give you some of my thoughts here, and I thought in addition to reading through my thoughts, actually seeing me work out a few things, some simple tutorials here might offer you some insight as well. So having said that, let's jump right into a Hello World assignment. Right here. So, Hello World, what is it for? Well, Hello World is simply just a check to make sure that we have everything set up we need to get started with our program. And what that means is contextual. It may mean something one day and mean something slightly different the next day depending on what the context is. But here I just want to make sure I can display something to my web server. So you can see here hello world.php. I've already set up Hello World PHP here, have my web server running, and you can see I didn't put a period here. Add the period, come back, refresh, and there it is. Okay. So again, it's just a simple exercise to say, okay, I've at least made my connectivity with my web server. Okay. I can go a little bit deeper now. I can add some HTML. So all I've done here, well, two things really. I've put HTML tags, opening and closing. Hopefully you remember from your HTML CSS course the concept of styling. So what I've done here is I've said in the styling, anytime I have an H1 tag, I want the text in that tag to be blue. Now in my PHP, right here, I echo out an H1 tag and a closing H1 tag. And in the middle, I put my echo for my hello world text. So in the end, PHP is going to print off this. Okay. These echo commands will print off to the browser this right here. Okay. So save that, come back over here, refresh, and sure enough, I get an H1 version of my text. I can inspect that element. I can see indeed it is an H1 tag, and I have my styling in here as well. I can change this to red, and sure enough it's red. And if I'm in a debugging mode, I can actually change that here to, whoops, I misspelled that. Try green. There we go, green worked. So I put green in, and when I refresh this now, it'll go back to red. because it goes back to the server and pulls back the PHP script. This is me changing it on the page, not touching the server. This is kind of a debug type of excuse me, a debug type of tool right here. Okay, so we have that. We've done it in Hello World. We have HTML, styling, and PHP in this Hello World example. The next thing in our lesson is variables. Now, what variables are, in some sense, are all the same across programming languages. But in some sense, and very importantly, in some sense, that languages like PHP have this weak typing of variables. Like if I use Java or C#, I actually have to tell the compiler what the variable is, what data type it is. In a language like Python or PHP, I let the compiler or the interpreter, or however it turns out to be in whatever case, whatever language it is, I let it determine what the data type is based upon the data I feed it. So in this case, when I run this, it's an integer. I've told it get type. Okay, tell me what data type that variable is. And in your lesson, based upon this W3 Schools article on PHP data types, I've listed the data types in PHP and then listed here the ones you should worry about for this lesson. So here you have an integer, but if I come back in here and say my name here, and I run that, it'll be a string. Even if I put a 1 in here, but with quotes, still a string. If I take the quotes off and put a decimal component, it's a double. And the last one to worry about for this lesson is the Boolean. Boolean is a true or false. Now, be clear, that is a string. For the Boolean to actually be a Boolean, it's true or false with no quotes. And there we go. Right. Basic example of a variable. So when I said in some sense the variable is the same across programming languages, in some ways it isn't. In the ways it's the same is, in this case, PHP is going to reserve a spot in memory and will put data into that spot in memory, and this here helps me reference that spot in memory. Okay. So also, like most programming languages, is there's rules associated with assigning a variable. Like I cannot assign a variable starting with a number. Okay. If I have to have it start with a number, then I have to also start it with an underbar. Can't start it with In your lesson here, you'll see some of the things I've already mentioned under the PHP Variables section. Some other things to mention here too that are called out in here is that you do have to have the $sign. If I come into here and, sorry, I need to get back to my lesson here. If I come in here and I try to take that $sign away, right? All sorts of things start blowing up on here, right? But if I go back in here, you see this red squiggly line indicating there's an error somewhere on my page. Add the $sign back in and all my problems go away, at least in this very small context right here. So looking back at the lesson. Casing is means something. So this is different from this. So you'll notice here that when I go back to my server and refresh that, I'm printing 1, 2, 3. If I want to print this guy, now I have 4, 5, 6. So casing matters even if it's technically the same letters. That's not true in all programming languages, but in this case, in PHP, it is. I would say most of the programming languages I have experience with, that is, it's either enforced by the language or it's enforced by good programming standards, good habits basically. But there are some out there that don't enforce that. And then anything else to say? Again, by standard, we typically use camel casing. Camel casing is like this, where the first word in a variable is undercased, and then the first letter of every word following is upper. So my variable that is a string, that would be camel casing right there. Okay. If you have camel casing where you have like an acronym, so let's say what's a good acronym here? Well, something like NASA, right? So NASA, the space agency, if I were to come and type NASA in here, I probably would use something like my variable for NASA, like that. If it's 3-letter acronym or greater, typically you treat it like a word. If it's a 2-letter acronym, like let's say a DJ, a disc jockey, guy playing music at a wedding. Okay, so my variable for the DJ, you would use both uppercase. That's just by standard. PHP doesn't enforce any of that. So I've said what I want to about variables. Now let's go to the conditional piece. Okay, so conditional means if something is true or false, but in this case I'll just state it like this. If something is true, we want to execute a certain programming path. So I have over here something I already, very, very basic generic example. If I can get back to where I want. So I declared this my variable to be a Boolean of true. And then I say, okay, if my variable is true, then echo print out as true, else print out as false. So come over here, I run that, and it says this is true. If I were to change this to false here, then that would print this is false. So what's going on here? Well, it's saying this is the same as, it's identical, the syntax means the same thing. If my variable equals true is exactly the same as that. So if it's true, print this and ignore the else. Kind of like a red light. If it's green, you go. If it's anything else, you're supposed to be trying to stop, right? That has 3 conditions. Think about something like lights, a light switch. That's 2 conditions, on or off. So if I flip it on, if the light switch is on, then the lights are on. If it's off, the lights are off. It's not one or both. It's not both. It's one or the other. Right. And the way I've written this here, it's one or the other. If it's true, do this. Everything else, there's only one other thing it can be, then print that. Something is slightly more complicated. Just adding a little more on now. Again, create a variable. In this case, it's 5. I check, is that variable, the data in that variable, less than 5? If it is, print less than 5. Every other condition, that would be 5.001, I mean anything greater than 5, print greater than or equal to 5. And notice I said equal to because 5 itself is not less than 5. So I slightly misstated that. It's not 5.001, it's 5 itself. Okay. So if I have 3 conditions, let's say I want to print less than 5, equal 5, and greater than 5. I can add a slightly different case to, or slightly different syntax here, an else if statement, where I can say my variable equals 5. Echo equal to 5, and I'm going to pull that off. And now when I run this, equal to 5. So clean that up a little bit. The logic here, the if statement, my variable less than 5 is false. This is a false statement. 5 is not less than 5. So I fall down to the next statement, which is an else if here. My variable equal to 5, that is a true statement. So I run this line and I skip everything else in the if else block is what I'm going to call it. If I were to change this to, I could add a lot of zeros there. This is false. This is false. So I don't even check a condition there. I just everything else. That's all that means. Check that condition. Check that condition. If both are false, you're done. Didn't save that. There we go. So can you only have one else if? No. I could do one other thing, like something like let's type that. My variable greater than 5 and my variable less than or equal to 6. So basically between 5 and 6, inclusive of 6, but exclusive of 5. Okay. So what do we have in this case when I run it? False, false, true. Skip. I'm going to change it to 10. Run it. Greater than 5. Let's change that to greater than 6 to be accurate now. So false, 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 everything else. And that pretty much is the topics in the first lesson here. All right, we're just basically wanting you to get comfortable with these 3 things right here. Declaring variables, initializing and changing data. So we did the variable. When I say declare and initialize, I'm talking about putting data an initial value into a variable. The initial and initialize, that's where that comes from. PHP people might balk at what I'm saying right there as far as initialize, but as far as just generic programming, that verbiage, that statement is used quite often to call this an initialization right here. And then changing variables, I can change it just simply by putting another number in there. So when I echo it right here, and I do the same right here, print that or save it, it printed 10, and I changed it to 12, and then it printed 12. I didn't put a line break in. Did I not put the just drawing a blank on line break? It's BR is just a straight BR tag. Okay. I need to do, I know what I did. I need to echo BR. That's what I wanted to do. There we go. So in this case, it was 10. I changed it to 12, and then it became 12. Okay. So back to declaring variables, initializing and changing data, printing data to screen using echo. We've done that quite a bit. And then the if else conditionals. If you have any additional questions to anything I've addressed here, clarification, additional things you want, etc., it doesn't matter. If it's related to this first lesson, please contact me, and I'll do my best to get it in. Even if it's a week later, I'll address the class that I'm adding it in. Again, this has been week 1 of the South Mountain PHP MySQL course. Thank you, and I look forward to interacting with you during the semester.